Hello, beautiful people and community. Welcome to Generational Archives, the show where we connect, heal, uncover through intergenerational conversations and archival research. I'm Dr. Raina J. León, your scholar, creative, intuitive researcher, and the daughter in this mother daughter collaborative. And I'm with my mother, Dr. Norma D. Thomas. How are you going to introduce yourself today, Mommy?
Well, I am the mother in the mother daughter duo, and welcome to another podcast.
So, today we're not going to focus on one individual. We're actually going to talk about the traveling museum that my mother created, memorializing the history, the workings of Black Fayette County, a county in western Pennsylvania. And we want to focus on the process of curating a traveling museum. What does it mean to have a traveling museum? And noting some of the things that are within it. Before we get into the process of curation, wanted to note some of the things that are listed. So, Mommy shared with me some of the exhibits within the museum, and some features are around the Underground Railroad history in Fayette County, Baker's Alley, the Black churches in Uniontown, Black cemeteries, the history of the KKK around Fayette County, Black owned newspapers, sports legends, Black homecoming, its celebration, its ending, and its recent revival, civil rights struggles, famous people who came from Uniontown, and we'll talk a little bit about those possible future editions for it. But I want to share with you all first why the focus on not a person, but on the traveling museum, this exhibition that moves from place to place. Actually came from you all. My mother and I, at the very beginning of the pandemic, we recorded a video with Mommy talking about some of the features of Fayette County and Black history there. And that video received over 500 views. And so we realized the importance of talking about something within a larger space that is very niche and yet is important within this time of Black history. And Black history should be celebrated every day, right? Especially in this time of contradictions, or rather contra movements against the sharing of Black history. So, Mommy, why a traveling museum in the first place? What was the impetus for curating these pieces?
Well, the impetus was, again, back to the beginning of collecting family history. And that
Mm,
family history expanded into finding all these documents about the history of Black people in Fayette County. Often we joke in Appalachia that people don't think there are Black people in
right.
Appalachia, but there are. And I know growing up, I did not get information about Black history in the region, Black history, period, but Black history in the region. And so, going back through family history and collecting all these documents, I realized that there is a rich history of African Americans in the Fayette County region of Pennsylvania. So I started putting them together in some logical progression that then led to panels, putting panels together of history that could be moved because I felt we needed to have that history. So many people didn't know anything about Black people in Fayette County. And I really wanted young people to be able to see their history because, from a cultural perspective, if you don't know your history, you don't know who you are. And if you don't know who you are, then you could be led in any kind of direction. So I wanted to create this sense of pride in young people to see that they did have a rich history in Fayette County, because a lot of the news reports, if you look at the local newspaper, is nothing but the negativity of what is happening in the community. And so I wanted to be able to show the positive bent of what we had accomplished, and that also leads to what we can accomplish, because if you know what you have accomplished and that there is this rich history, then you know what can be done and can move forward. So that was the impetus for putting together something that could be moved. It's starting to be more difficult to move and display all this material, but because it is a lot of material. And so what has been selected so far is not the whole universe of what I've been able to uncover.
So it sounds like the importance of instilling a generational pride. And I'm really curious about where are some of the places where you have brought the traveling museum, particularly because of your own background as a social worker. It's been very much rooted in bringing the history to the community where folks will be, where they can interact with the materials. So where has the traveling museum gone?
The Traveling Museum has only been displayed actually in two places, but on several occasions. So one of those places is John Wesley AME Zion Church, and it has been displayed there for a specific reason, and that's the church's connection to the Underground Railroad, or at least the stories around the Underground Railroad in Uniontown and the connection to Baker Alley. And so that is one reason it has been displayed there many times. We've done Facebook Live discussions and displayed the museum that way, but it's been at John Wesley AME Zion Church. The other place that it has been displayed is the East End United Community Center. So for those two places, which are in the East End of Uniontown, Pennsylvania, which has a very large percentage of the population who are African American. And so we wanted to display it where people could see it and come to it, could walk or drive, and be able to come to the museum. So we've done it online, but the physical space, it has been displayed in those two places.
And you've also done walking tours. Can you tell me about some of those walking tours?
Yes, the Uniontown Hospital for a few years had their Walking Wednesday tours, and in connection with the community center, we decided to participate in the walking tours of Black Fayette County. And specifically because it was a walking tour, we focused on the East End. So we start at the community center, we go to John Wesley Church, we go through Baker Alley. We, at one time, passed the Lance Funeral Home, which has its own history in Uniontown, Pennsylvania, and the proprietor of the funeral home was in there, could hear me talking on the loudspeaker and came out to talk to people who were following me around the community. We go into various churches based on the availability of the church, and so we walk by many of the Black churches, and then we proceed to go by the high school where a number of the famous athletes have come from. And so we do this walking tour. This last time we added the history of the quote-unquote colored school in Uniontown, because people don't realize that Uniontown had a segregated history. And so we talk about that history as well and give highlights along the way in terms of the playground of champions with on the East End and the former East End school, and give a history of Black Uniontown, where there was a newspaper that was African American owned, and provide that information. And we end in Clearview Cemetery, which is on the east end of Uniontown. About 500 or more people are buried there. It is almost exclusively an African American cemetery, and talk about the history and the current proprietor that is taking care of that graveyard. that has almost a third of the people buried there are veterans from as far back as the Civil and Spanish American Wars.
So I want to note too that the Traveling Museum started with you. It started with one person saying, this history is important. I needed this history as a young person. There are young people, this community needs this history. And my family is tied up in this history, is a part of this history, and deserves to be remembered within an archive. Let me create the archive. I want to uplift that because perhaps there are people listening who are like, I have a history here. My community needs to know part of this unique quality, this hidden culture uh, that has been erased or pushed aside. What can I do? It can start with the individual, and this that individual movement ends up leading to so many others knowing the history. You have shared with me before about a walking tour that you had where you gathered people along the way. So can you tell me about that experience of having one tour with that might have started small and then became much bigger?
Well, when we've done the walking tours, I've always been surprised at how many people have been interested. It has been upwards of 100 people following me around the East End, most of them being white people who have been interested in participating in the walking tour. So it's always been fascinating to me as this African American woman turning around and having this large number of people coming to hear about the history of African Americans on the East End. And people have been very interested. This last walking tour we did during Juneteenth. We had a number of Juneteenth celebrations. The first time there had been a Juneteenth celebration, to my knowledge, in Uniontown. And it was small, but we had a number of people join us and become very, very interested in a number of the aspects of that tour that we were talking about, and have since engaged in continuous conversation about that history tour. And I've spoken now to a group of teachers who are teaching history in Uniontown and about bringing that history to life for those students. So one aspect of the traveling museum has been, it has not been just my information that I have gathered. Over the last several years, I've put out this call to people saying to them, if you don't know what to do with your family history, please give it to me. And that has resulted in people who have cleaned out attics and put information in trash bags and brought it to the community center because they didn't know what to do with it. And I have just employed people over and over to not throw this away. And that has resulted, some information is not up on movable panels for the museum. Some of it I put together in notebooks. And when we display the traveling museum, the notebooks are there as well for people to go through and look at the history. And so I still put that out there, that there is someone who probably in your own community is putting together this history that maybe you don't know about, but you can find out about. I have a friend in the city of Chester, for example, who has put together a lot of material on the history of the city of Chester and is also involved in bringing back the African American cemeteries in that area. So there are others who are in your local community who are trying to put together as much of the history as they can. So find those individuals, seek them out. If you find material that you don't know what to do with, please don't throw it away because it is invaluable to the history of that community.
And the person in Chester is Miss Twyla Simpkins, and she has the Yes We Can Center, which re-enlivens a former YWC, yeah,
YWCA.
yeah, and has created it into a cultural center. And she has the most amazing programs. She was a Chester educator, long time beloved educator herself, and so infuses her work with deep connection with the community, especially young people. And I also really appreciate, Mommy, that you highlighted your work with teachers within the Fayette County Uniontown community and sharing with them the history, because as a teacher educator, as a former educator myself, I know the power of educators in drawing young people into a deeper connection with their community through history, through interviews. So I want to uplift, even within this conversation, the invitation to teachers to connect with elders within the community. That's even part of an article that we wrote on age futurism, right? The idea of teachers doing walking tours with their young people and identifying community members that may continue to live within that community who could participate in interviews from their porches, and to document those interviews for the future long after those beings, those folks that we know have transitioned into ancestors. Perhaps those interviews can give us context for the community of the past. And so that is a part of the future, building into holding the voices of this present and holding the images of the past. I want to go ahead.
Two things I would like to say. One is that sometimes older adults think that young people don't want to hear those stories. And that is so not true. I mean, we've talked about what I didn't realize, how much you listened to the stories, and talked about how when we would tell stories, me and my siblings, how we did it with such joy about the people who had gone before us. So that's one. Young people do want to hear the stories. Tell them the stories, give them the information. The other is there's a former educator in Uniontown that actually had the idea and didn't know I was already doing it, to pull together information for students, because she felt it was very, very important for young people to get this information. And then she heard about the traveling museum and realized that I had already started pulling some things together. But it doesn't mean that multiple people can't attack this from multiple aspects, because we all have our particular interest in what we want to bring forth. And so all of us need to be pulling together the information on this history, because not only is it important for us as adults, it is so important for young people, because in this time where there is an effort to erase efforts to bring forth Black history, we know that Black history it's still not extensively taught in so many places. There is just nothing. I'm involved in a weekly discussion on essentially the history that nobody knows about, Black history. And it's a purposeful discussion on Mondays for about 6 weeks to bring out the history of African Americans in the United States. And the comments that I heard were that we didn't know this, we didn't know this, we didn't know this. Well, this is 2023. And so if people still don't know the extent of the contribution of African Americans to the history of the United States, then what do we think young people growing up in these communities who are African American, they don't know their own history. They don't realize the significant contributions that their people have made to their own region. And I can't stress enough how important that cultural connection is, so that people take pride, people know what has been accomplished from people who have gone before them, and that this is not a mystery. This is 365, that that everyone should know this history. And it's not just for African Americans to know their own history, even though that is extremely important to me, but it's for everyone to know the extent of that history. And sometimes in places like rural America, where I'm from, that history has just been hidden.
And I want to also emphasize how young people can be a part of the research process too, right? Educators who are learning about the history themselves can share that. And next thing you know, young people are doing research, they're interviewing their elders, they're compiling those stories into comics, into videos, into contributions that can also be a part of this collective story so that the stories become greater in their preservation and more expansive and richer and deeper. And with that, I want to shift into one of the aspects that is preserved. You mentioned John Wesley and that as a site of the walking tour, but also a site of the sharing of the traveling museum. And John Wesley is known by another moniker, which is the Freedom Church, because of its understood relationship with the Underground Railroad and Baker Alley. Can you tell us about that history, Baker Alley, and this Underground Railroad connection with John Wesley Church?
Well, the Freedom Church name is attached to the whole denomination of the John Wesley AME Zion denomination. So their involvement in civil rights struggles from the beginning. But for this particular church, the oral history, there have been about 3 different buildings. One of the buildings would have been constructed during the time of slavery and the Underground Railroad. And so the oral history from the church is that when slaves would be transported on Route 40 through Uniontown, and again, this is in Pennsylvania, but there were slaves in Fayette County, and they were transported over the historical Route 40, that some escaped into the church. There was a coal chute that they talk about, that they would escape, go through a tunnel that led to a house on Baker Alley. We have not been able to authenticate the tunnel from Route 40 to Baker Alley, so it hasn't been authenticated, but that's the oral history. The house on Baker Alley did exist. That has been authenticated, and people often hid underground while the slave hunters were looking for people. So there was an underground component to this house. And then they either made their way on to Freedom up to Canada, or some stayed in the Baker Alley area, the east end of Uniontown. It was also called Little Haiti. So it was said that if people escaped into the east end or Little Haiti, that the slave catchers would not go into that area because they were afraid. And so one reason that part of Uniontown has a significant African-American population is the connection to the Underground Railroad. There is a placard that sits on Route 40 to commemorate Baker Alley as a site on the Underground Railroad. So that part has been authenticated. And there's also a stone in Baker Alley that commemorates its role in the Underground Railroad as well. And last year at Juneteenth, we laid flowers to honor those who had passed through on their way to freedom.
And you've also mentioned the East End United Community Center, another site where the Traveling Museum has been seen. And there is some history there as far as its founding, because Grandmom was a part of the founding community, correct?
Yes, your grandmother was very active in civil rights in Uniontown at the time. Uniontown has a long history of civil rights struggle. it was segregated in many ways in terms of where you could and could not go. I remember that as a young person. And for people older than me, segregation was very clear in terms of where you could sit in the movie theaters and what you could and could not do. And the East End United Community Center was born out of the civil rights struggle. There was a movement to close the East End School, which was predominantly African American, under the guise of desegregation. But the school was going to close. The community protested vigorously. There was rioting in Uniontown. There were protests. There was boycotts. And the school remained open for a year after the proposed closing, but eventually was closed. And out of that decommissioned school became the first East End United Community Center until it moved to Main Street and then moved to its current location. But my mother was one of the original incorporators, along with several other people who were involved in that original struggle. And they purposely put the United in the name to represent that after all the struggles, the community was coming together to unite to create this community center space. And it's been in existence since 1975.
And I think it's also poignant that this would have happened around the time that you were an undergrad, graduate student. And wasn't it that grandmom had asked you a little bit about the process for incorporation? Like you had some stake in helping for the understanding of incorporation documents?
Yes, it's one of those things that after, there was some point that I reflected back that I was in graduate school from 1974 to 76, so I was out of Uniontown in Philadelphia, and I was taking a course on proposal writing, actually. And she wanted me to write a proposal to create a community center. And it was very clear the kinds of things she wanted in that community center. And then in 1975, there was this community center. So I always felt like I had a role in the East End United Community Center. And I sit on the board and have for a number of years been involved in the community center. So it's something that I inherited and will be involved probably for life. Because when I moved back for a time to the Fayette County area, the first thing I did was to seek out getting on the board of the East End United Community Center, because that was clearly part of the history, part of the struggle. And it says what a community can do when it comes together, because they are in a multi-million-dollar building right now that was, a lot of the money was donated by one major benefactor, but we cannot negate the efforts of the community to raise the funds also to get that building built.
And the reason I emphasize your possible connection with the founding of the center is that when folks are thinking about creating their own institutions, community centers, museums with a fixed location, or a traveling museum, don't forget that you have influences, education, insights within your own community. And there might be folks who can write that proposal, can help you to conceptualize a community offering in some way where you can dream it and they can help you to realize that dream.
Well, and actually right now that is the discussion about making this traveling museum into a permanent location, because there is now a lot of material. There is more that could be displayed. Traveling with it and putting it up and taking it down is not an easy feat these days. And should we buy something, rent something, so that this museum gets the access to many, many more people, and it's permanent, and there's a permanent place for people to bring items to even temporarily add to the collection, to have displayed. I have had people, when we say we're going to display the museum, bring information to display temporarily. And so, is that something that becomes a curated museum versus a curated traveling museum? It takes a leap of faith. My daughter has said, go for it. and
Yes.
and so that is the current discussion about making this a permanent exhibit versus traveling exhibit.
So maybe as we speak it, then we are also summoning it. I want to uplift to others too, as they perhaps are thinking about similar concerns of, oh, I have all these documents, where do they go? Around connecting with archives, around copying things and sharing beyond the individual with, your local state archives or community archives. The other thing that I want to uplift is that there are models for community sharing of archives. Libro Mobile in Santa Ana in California with Sarah Rafael Garcia, as well as I think about the Robeson House here in Philadelphia with Christopher Rogers as one of the program directors. Both places actually have a room for digital archiving for community members to come and share some of their archival materials and to be supported in documenting them. And perhaps that's something that the traveling museum that may soon have a fixed location, a museum for Black Fayette County, could also have a location for the digitization of records and photos and materials so that that can be shared beyond the one individual holder. And I know I've emphasized this in the past, but I'll say it again for those who might need to hear it this time or again and again and again, of having a plan for the archival materials and also trying as much as possible to record, copy, share so that a material doesn't just live in the hands of one person. So I I wanted to go back to one of the materials or one of the notes that you are also holding within the museum that you've documented, or rather two. One are the Black cemeteries, and then the other is the history of the KKK around Fayette County. So, Black cemeteries, you note that there are at least three within the Uniontown, Fayette County community that specifically focus on Black community members. And I'm curious about why you think the recognition of Black cemeteries and the preservation of them is important to community.
Well, people are remembered or are known for how they care for all members of their community, those who are living and those who have transitioned. And unfortunately, often for so many reasons, African American cemeteries sometimes go into disrepair and are not upkept. People have moved away, communities have been uprooted. All kinds of things can happen as to why these cemeteries have not been maintained well. And so it's important to uncover, and there are sources of history, but we have to honor those who came before us. We need to make sure that that history is preserved. So in Uniontown, the Thomas Cemetery, which is where so many of my family members are buried, was established in 1913, and it has never gone into disrepair. So that's one source of pride, that somewhere somebody has always taken care of that cemetery. But there are some graves that are not marked. We in the Generational Archives podcast have talked about my Uncle Francis being buried in the Thomas Cemetery, and there is no marker. And that did happen with some of those small markers that the funeral home gives, and over time, if they were not replaced by a stone marker, then they may be lost. And so that, I know my family has been looking into finding some of the maps and some of the information to make sure we know where everyone is buried. But that cemetery has always been upkept, and it was a family tradition to go out on Memorial Days and clean off the graves and even have picnics and socialize with family members. So that was clearly part of our history. Clearview Cemetery is a very large cemetery in Uniontown. It has gone into disrepair on occasion. When we talked about my Aunt Doris in a podcast, we talked about not being able to get into that cemetery to bury her. She was buried there, but the family could not go in because it was so overgrown. And my dad became the caretaker for a number of years. And after he died, there were different efforts to bring it back. And now it is brought back. It's a beautiful location that still has aspects to be uncovered because not all the acreage has been brought back. There are efforts to bring it back in total. There is an additional cemetery that's a little outside of town that almost nobody knows about. It is called Uniondale. The person who told me about the cemetery called it Stony Lonesome. And I have since found that there are a number of graves, a number of cemeteries that have this moniker, Stony Lonesome. So I don't know why it was applied to this particular place, but it's Union or Uniondale in the records. It's a very small cemetery, but you would have to know it was there to be able to find it. The person who took me there, I think, actually wanted to pass on the information that this cemetery is there. And we uncovered a few of the headstones. It's not easily accessible, but we were able to go to this cemetery. And there are a number of prominent names from the Uniontown area in that cemetery. So it's another one to put on the list of bringing back so that the people who are there have folks can go visit who might have relatives there. Because again, right now you wouldn't know it was there unless somebody told you exactly where it was located. There are also African American Cemetery in Brownsville, Pennsylvania, which is in Fayette County, and a number of others around the area. So it's important to honor those who have passed on before us.
There's even a project in Pennsylvania called the Hallowed Grounds Project, which is all about preserving cemeteries so that they don't fall away into not being remembered. So around this remembrance, and this is the last thing before we close up, I'm curious about why you decided to also note around the history of the KKK in Fayette County. Why was that important to document?
Because it's part of that whole civil rights struggle. It exists. People did not know that there was a very active KKK history in the area, that just like every place else, it was designed to be intimidating for African American people, that there were cross burnings, there were those demonstrations, there were the White Hoods, it was in the paper. I have the newspaper clippings up well into the 80s, and what people don't realize is the number of hate groups in the state of Pennsylvania. And so where I'm from, it was part of our history. Again, we were segregated, and so at school maybe you were integrated, but most of the rest of your life you lived very segregated lives in terms of African Americans and white people in the region. So it is part of the history. It is part of what we need to know about. I think young people should know about the struggles, the civil rights struggles of African Americans in the area, and that to know that those struggles still continue, but that we can all rise above them.
And that piece, I think, is so important, that there is this history of struggle, there's this history of hate, and there's also a counter history of love and connection and community building and resistance, and still continual creation of institutions of pride and joy in one another.
And just as a last aside, based on something you just said, there was a strong sense of community, that we survived as a community because we were so very much intertwined, very much in the struggle, but also in the joy, and that growing up in Uniontown, Pennsylvania, it was a wonderful, wonderful experience, and it would be remiss of us not to pass on all of that information, which is one of the reasons I think the Black Homecoming Committee was revised so that people would be able to once again share that sense of community and share it with people who are younger that might not have experienced the same level of community engagement that we all did.
And, you've shared stories of growing up in Uniontown where there were horses nearby and lots of fruit trees and fresh milk from the nearby dairy and the doctor who came to visit because the doctors did house calls at the time. And so there were these moments of idyllic life too. And even if you didn't have much money, that there was a barter culture and community support. So my grandfather, your father being a mechanic, and if there wasn't so much money for the hats that my grandmother wanted to wear for church, there was a barter, or there was an accumulation of an account. So the connection in joy and in struggle, and definitely we are all in this together. So that is our show for today. And we want to emphasize too around this aspect of generational pride and encourage you to continue to listen, to follow us on all the things. We're on Instagram with various posts. You can support us on Patreon as well and share the news about subscribing with others. And we are so thankful for your continual listening. And in our next episode, we'll be talking about a trip that we took to South Carolina and sharing some of the research methods that we took on when we went there, before we return to talking about individual family members again as a way of sharing methods for you to discover, recover your people, your ancestors, and dream into the future. Do the healing that is necessary for this moment, and so that the future can be bright and unfolding and beautiful. Thank you so much for listening to Generational Archives, and we deeply appreciate you.